Hello, welcome to my presentation on teacher beliefs concerning a foreign language in elementary school program in a Japanese city. The present study was conducted out of a desire to better understand how the implementation of a foreign language in an elementary school program has impacted a local community of language learners and teachers in different junior high schools throughout a community in Japan. In 2008, the local Board of Education introduced a FLES program in the local elementary schools to help supplement the junior high school program in an effort to improve language achievement. Whereas children used to start learning English between the ages of 11 and 12, they currently begin at age 6. Thus, current students who have successfully completed the FLES in junior high school program have had 9 years of English education as opposed to the previous 3 years before the FLES program. Research on adults looking at their ultimate attainment in this area has been able to show that those who entered into a native speaking environment between the ages of 1 and 7 years of age can develop native-like fluency in their eventual ultimate attainment as adults. This is confirmed by the research of Johnson and Newport, 1989, De Keyser, 2000, Abrahamson and Heiltenstam, 2008. Much of the research in this area uses grammaticality judgment tests, the modern language aptitude tests, or the MLAT, and questionnaires about the learner's history of learning a language. Looking at the graph taken from Johnson and Newport's 1989 study, we can see that the implication that an early age of onset has an eventual fluency on eventual fluency as adults. When children are infants is one of the few instances in which a low input exposure can lead to a native-like ability. According to Cole, Fengming Cao, and Hui-Mei Liu, 2003, infants can detect the differences in phonetic changes among any language in the world. This ability decreases between the ages of 6 and 12 months of age. Their research was able to show that this window of phonetic sensitivity can be extended by introducing new and novel sounds to native-born American babies at 9 months of age. The novel sounds were from Mandarin Chinese and are difficult for adult English speakers to differentiate. Despite this fact, American infants who were exposed to 12 sessions of 25 minutes over a 4-week period were able to differentiate these sounds. Furthermore, the American babies were able to differentiate the sounds with nearly the same ability as Taiwanese babies of the same age. One earlier study by Tata, Wood, and Lowenthal in 1981 looked at the ramifications on age on how well learners could replicate the sounds in the foreign language. In particular, the researchers wanted to look at pronunciation and intonation of learners for particular ages. The premise for looking at specific aspects regarding pronunciation and intonation was because previous research had found conflicting reports about younger versus older learners. Their study, looking at 231 monolingual children who spoke English as a first language and who were between the ages of 5 and 15, found that the ability to reproduce the intonation and pronunciation of foreign language words and phrases decreased with age. The previous research shows that there was a benefit for an earlier age of onset. One thing to look back at is that Johnson and Newport 1989 data that suggests that the earlier one is exposed to the second language, the more fluent the learner will become in their eventual ultimate attainment. One important point that has come up since their research is that the environment and the amount of input is of critical importance in regard to how much impact age of first exposure has on the ultimate attainment. To cite Larson Hall, contrary to what a layperson may think, age does not confer a magical ability to learn a second language quickly and natively, and a situation of minimal input. Some of the research that has taken place in low-input foreign language learning environments has not shown a clear advantage to an earlier or later starting age. This has been noted by Munoz in her 2011 research, who looked at college students who had studied English in Spain to examine the long-term effects of starting age and the effects of input in an instructed language setting. Her research looked at both an early age of first exposure within a group of 146 individuals and a later starting age of first exposure among a group of 16 individuals. The age of first exposure ranging from 2 to 11 is the first group, and age of first exposure from 11 to 15 and a half is the second group. Students were given a phonetic identification test, the Oxford Placement Test, a lexical reception test, as well as a questionnaire to get better understanding of their learning background. Her research found no statistical advantage for either of the groups. She speculated that the earlier age of first exposure advantage was not present because children with an earlier exposure simply did not have the amount of exposure necessary to show any benefit. Larson Hall in 2008 did a similar study looking at two groups of university-age learners in Japan. Again, these groups were divided into an earlier age of first exposure group with 61 participants and a later age of first exposure group with 139 participants. In this study, the earlier learners had begun learning English between the ages of 3 and 12, and the later learners had begun learning English between the ages of 12 and 13 years of age. In her research, Larson Hall was able to find a slight advantage on grammaticality judgment tests for an earlier starting age, but this happened only when the number of hours of exposure began to enter into the 1,833 to 2,000 hour range of input. Before this number of hours of exposure, later starters had more of an advantage. Her research was also able to show that learners with an earlier age of first exposure were able to perform better on phonemic discrimination tasks. Earlier starters surpassed the later starters near the 1,000 hour mark in a phonemic discrimination test, but fell back below later starters near the 2,500 hour mark, only to once again pass the late starters at the 3,500 hour mark. These results show that there is a potential to pass later starters after a certain amount of input is present. Here we see that the amount of input is in conjunction with an early age of first exposure can be quite beneficial. One more benefit among learners in the early age of first exposure group in her study was that the questionnaire results showed that generally these learners had slightly better self-opinions regarding their abilities with language and had somewhat better feelings towards studying language in general and English in particular. That is, on a 10-point scale, with 10 being equal to loving language study, earlier starters had a mean average of 7.0 compared to 6.4 for later starters. Specifically, for studying English, earlier starters had a mean average of 7.1 compared to 6.5 for later starters. Looking at anxiety, McIntyre and Gardner in their 1994 study conducted a study with university students studying French looking at the effects of language anxiety on the input, processing, and output stages. They found that there was a significant negative relationship between grades in all three stages of input, processing, and output. Some findings in particular to each stage were that anxious learners were slower at recognition than more relaxed learners at the recognition stage, though accuracy was not impacted. A paragraph translation task specific to the processing stage also showed that anxious students had a disadvantage compared to less anxious students. Distribution for the paired associations tasks, which measure the processing and output stage, showed that anxious students needed more time for studying and for finishing the assessment than their less anxious counterparts looking at the output stage. There was a negative correlation of student success and anxiety on 3 separate measures: a thing category test, a closed test, and a self-description task. All 3 measures showed a negative correlation between levels of anxiety and ability at the output stage. An investigation by Gans, Xiao, and Sparks, 1996, compared native language ability with foreign language ability among female high school students. By implementing the foreign language classroom anxiety scale, developed by Horwitz and Cope, 1986, they were able to divide participants into 3 levels of anxiety: a low anxiety group, an average anxiety group, and a high anxiety group. In general, it was found that the low anxiety group performed better than the average anxiety group and high anxiety group, and the average anxiety group performed better than the high anxiety group. In other words, the more anxiety, the lower the performance. Proficiency scores have been researched a great deal, yet there is still yet a complete answer in regards to an ideal combination of age of onset and hours of exposure. Larson Hall recommends utilizing both to the fullest extent possible. She says, quote, "My recommendation would be to begin foreign language study as young as possible, with as many hours of input as possible. With evidence of even modest benefits to a younger start for foreign language, it then seems worthwhile to include the subject in the curriculum, especially as most studies concur that positive attitudes toward language learning develop with an early start." With the amount of research showing that the age of first exposure, hours of exposure, and anxiety have an impact on language learning, what impact do we see in learner populations after the implementation of a FLES program? To further explore this question, we will look at some available data to try and answer the following research questions. Number 1. What changes do we see after the implementation of the FLES program in regard to quantitative assessments such as the Prefectural Simultaneous English Test, or PSET, and the Aiken exam? Number 2, when comparing learners without the FLES program experience and those who participate in the program, how do Japanese teachers of English perceive student abilities in the 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening? Furthermore, how do JTEs perceive student abilities in the more specific areas of grammar learning, vocabulary learning, pronunciation, and completing listening tasks? Lastly, number 3, when comparing learners before and after the program, how do JTEs perceive the affective characteristics of students in regard to positive attitudes towards language learning and shyness? In particular, when comparing learners before and after the program, how do JTEs perceive the level of enjoyment, the amount of shyness interacting with foreign teachers, and the amount of openness towards language learning? There are 3 measures that may help open the window into the research questions. The first is a comparison of the prefecture city score, mean averages longitudinally from the mandatory Prefectural Simultaneous English Test, or PSET. The PSET is given to 8th and 9th graders in junior high schools throughout the prefecture every year. Since 9th graders will represent the learner population at the end of the junior high school program, only data from this grade will be used. Data for the PSET was only available for 4 years, 2011, 2013, 2017, and 2018. The second is a comparison of Aiken test pass rates among the volunteer test participants longitudinally. The Aiken proficiency test is an English proficiency test widely used in Japan. Most often it is used in elementary schools, junior high schools, and high schools. It has also been used in technical colleges and universities, and even by teachers or adult professionals. The last is a survey of JTEs who taught students who did not participate in the FLES program and students who did. The third instrument is the survey given to the participant teachers. The survey has 14 Likert-style items and looks at a number of topics including improvement in reading, writing, listening, and speaking, effective characteristics of learning before and after the program, and 8 statements based on the topics that came up in the conversations with JTEs and administrators before the survey was given. These items are a way to attempt to confirm observation among teachers regarding attitudes towards learning English as a foreign language, attitudes towards teachers known as assistant language teachers, and learners' abilities with learning different aspects of language in the classroom. The Likert-style items will help in the final report to quantify the data, as the numbers on the scale will help operationalize the degree of agreement or disagreement with the statement on the survey. The participants in the survey were licensed Japanese teachers of English who had been in the city teaching junior high school both prior to and during the implementation of the FLES program. That is, they had taught both the first group of learners without a FLES experience who had a late age of onset between the ages of 11 and 12, and the second group of learners with the FLES experience who have an early age of onset around the age of 6. These participants were approached about the opportunity to participate in the survey and interview, and were informed of the complete voluntary nature of participation, any possible risks, steps that would be taken to protect the confidentiality of their data, and the opportunity to discontinue their participation at any point and for any reason with no negative consequences. One of the main points of interest in the results of the PSED scores is the gap between the prefectural average and the average of the city. Looking at the results of the 9th grade performance on the population of the city and the prefecture average, we can see that there is a marked narrowing of the gap between the years 2011 and 2013. Prior to the implementation of the FLES program, the performance average of the city was lagging behind the prefectural average. Since the implementation of the program, they have caught up significantly with the prefecture. It also shows a fairly steady increase in prefectural and city averages together. Since data from the Aiken proficiency test was available for the city during the years of 2009 to 2015, when looking at the percentage of test takers who took the 3rd grade Aiken proficiency test, which is designed to assess junior high school students, we see that there is an increase in the percentage of successful participants over a 6-year period. One important point is that we can see that the first year of the data in 2009 shows a pass rate of 50.6%, which drops to 36.7% in the following year, 2010. It takes 2 years to come back to this path. It takes 2 years to come back to past this point in 2012. From this point, there is a gradual progression, and the final year of 2015 shows a 16.5% increase in the pass rates from the year the report started in 2009. In reviewing different perspectives among teachers in regard to the 4 skills, most of the consensus, that is, among 4 of the 6 respondents, was that speaking and listening abilities improved, while many, 5 of the 6 respondents, had neutral reactions to whether there was any improvement in reading and writing. One teacher even felt that listening had greatly improved. While most teachers felt neutral in regard to reading and writing, one teacher did feel that writing had improved, and another teacher felt that reading had improved as well. Regarding the students' affective characteristics, in general, teachers felt that there had been a decrease in anxiety and an increase in motivation among learners who had participated in the FLES program. In fact, 2 teachers felt that anxiety had greatly decreased in the 10-year period, which was one of the stronger reactions in the survey. 4 teachers felt that motivation had increased since the FLES program had begun. The survey questions had various reactions from the teachers. The areas that had the most consensus will be discussed here. Some statements had either strong agreement or agreement with no neutral or negative reactions. One such statement was that the students seemed less shy interacting with ALTs or other foreigners than before their program. Another statement that fits into this category was that students seemed to have an easier time learning pronunciation before the program. Another statement that fits into this category was that the students seemed to have an easier time learning pronunciation than before the program. Some other statements had mostly agreement with one or two neutral or disagreement reactions. Those statements would be that students seemed to enjoy learning English more than 10 years ago, and that students seem to have an easier time completing listening tasks than they did 10 years ago. The statement students who started English in the 7th grade seem much more open to learning English 10 years ago had an even spread of 2 for strongly agree, 2 for agree, and 2 neutral responses, though most were in agreement with the statement. Lastly, some statements either had an even balance between agreement and neutral or disagreement, or a majority neutral response. These statements had the least amount of support and included the following statements. The first was, more students with special talents or special skills with English were present. The second statement was, students had an easier time learning grammar. And the third statement was, students had an easier time learning vocabulary after the implementation of the FLES program. Starting our discussion section, we return to look at our research questions. Prior to the implementation of the FLES program, the city average was well below the prefectural average. In the year 2011, by which point the students had experienced 3 to 4 years of English education, we can see that the city is 8.5 points below the average scores of the prefecture. In 2013, when the city's 9th graders would have had 5 to 6 years of English education, this jumps up to 2 points below the prefectural average. For the 9th graders during this year, the average age of onset is around 10 and 11 years of age. There's a slight 2.7 point decrease in city averages in 2017, with 9 years of exposure, which rebounds to 7.4 points in 2018, also within 9 years of exposure. Despite some small fluctuations, one could speculate that in line with the reasoning of Larson Hall, who speculated that an increase in hours of exposure and an earlier age of onset could be beneficial in improving performance among students on the PSET. The pass rate of the Aiken exam also showed steady increase in pass rates among test takers despite an early drop in pass rates between 2009 and 2010, before participants in the FLES program would be in the 9th grade. Following this drop, there is a progressive and steady increase for most years from 2010 to 2015. Again, in line with previous research on hours of exposure and age of onset, one could speculate that the FLES program was one important component in the increase of performance on the Aiken exam. Both the PSET and Aiken showed an increase in performance over the period in question. That is, we see an improvement of 15.4 points in average test scores over the period of available data for the PSET, and we see an improvement of 16.5 in pass rates over the period of available data for the initial average. While there are potential validity and reliability issues with the PSET as the prefectural and city averages both rise, we can speculate there is merit to the improvement being valid because both assessments show a gradual improvement over the period of available data. Unfortunately, the improvements are still yet to pass the prefectural average on the PSET. One possible reason for the limitations of the FLES program to help students improve further could be due to the fact that the students did not have more reading and writing during the FLES program, and because both assessments relied on students' reading and writing abilities. This sentiment came up a few times in discussions with teachers and administrators. Because of this, these assessments may not have been able to help students break beyond the perfectual average on the PSET test. Research question 2 asked, when comparing learners before and after the program, how do JTEs perceive student abilities in the 4 skills areas? Furthermore, how do JTEs perceive student abilities in the more specific areas of grammar learning, vocabulary learning, pronunciation, and completing listening tasks? 4 out of 6 JTEs perceived student speaking skills to improve, while 2 teachers marked neutral responses. As the majority believed that speaking had improved, this lends to support the findings of Tata and others in 1981, who reported that there was a phonological benefit for younger learners in ability to pronounce words. Most teachers perceived that students' listening skills improved, with one teacher believing that students' listening skills had greatly improved, while another teacher gave a neutral response. In the comments section on the last page of the survey, the only teacher to respond in this section wrote that, quote, students get to know English better than the last 10 years, especially they used to speak English, unquote. For both reading and writing, 5 out of 6 teachers marked neutral responses indicating they neither felt it improved or declined. One teacher marked that both reading and writing improved. In general, we can see that teachers believe that speaking and listening skills improved while reading and writing skills did not. This may be due to the lack of reading and writing in the FLES program, as previously mentioned. Our last research question asks, when comparing learners before and after the program, how do JTEs perceive the affective characteristics of students in regard to motivation and anxiety? In particular, when comparing learners before and after the program, how do JTEs perceive the level of enjoyment, the amount of shyness interacting with foreign teachers, and the amount of openness towards language learning? Looking at the affective factors of anxiety, 3 JTEs felt that anxiety had greatly decreased, while another felt that it had decreased, with another JTE giving a neutral response, and one stating that anxiety had increased. While there was not complete consensus among the JTEs, 3 stating that anxiety had greatly increased was the strongest reaction among all of the survey questions. In addition, there was consensus in that all were in agreement with the statement, quote, students seem less shy to interacting with ALTs or other foreigners than 10 years ago, unquote. With 3 marking strongly agree and 3 marking agree, Horowitz, and Cope, 1986 stipulate that a more anxious student tends to avoid attempting difficult or personal messages in the target language, unquote. Furthermore, anxious students tend to exhibit more forms of avoidance behaviors towards language or public speaking tasks. If a reduction of anxiety is present, the opposite may become apparent as previous shy junior high school students make more attempts at communicating with foreigners and cease avoidance behaviors and activities that involve speaking in front of others. It is possible that being around foreigners at a younger age for Japanese learners is a particularly freeing experience for them. Japan is known as a particular high context monoculture, and meeting foreigners as adults may cause communication difficulties, misunderstandings, and subsequent anxiousness. If Japanese learners become used to being around foreign people at an earlier age, they may begin to view foreigners as a natural part of their life and not something very novel and unusual. This may in turn lead to less anxiety interacting with them. One particular sentiment sometimes mentioned by foreigners living in the city is that, while other parts of Japan they have lived in at times seemed as standoffish by the local population, the current city is different in nature regarding reactions by locals, and particularly younger children. One local ALT had the following to say about the differences between the current city and previous cities he had lived in. Quote, in Tanaka City, pseudonym, I think they have been exposed to a lot of foreigners for a start. They also get much higher frequency of English classes with foreigners. So I feel that there is a familiarity with having a foreigner in the classroom. They are more open to chatting with you. Definitely easier to build a better relationship. Interviewer. Do you notice a difference when walking around town? ALT. Sure. Interviewer. When you see a student or just a regular young ALT, I feel the places I have lived where the curriculum started in elementary school are generally much more welcoming for foreigners to live. In conclusion, after the implementation of the FLES program, there was a steady increase of city averages on the PSET and a gradual increase of pass rates on the ACAN. In addition, a majority of teachers perceived that there was an increase in motivation and decrease in anxiety, as well as an increase in speaking and listening skills. One of the strongest agreements on the survey was that there was a decrease in anxiety. While these improvements are admirable, there is still room for some improvement as the city still stands slightly below the prefectural average. As often mentioned by administrators and teachers during the research, one of the biggest areas that FLES program lacked was in the reading and writing skills area. A more rounded introduction of the basic reading and writing skills in the FLES program may help further improve student performance in the city. Perhaps one difficult obstacle in junior high school is the rapid introduction of reading and writing in the 7th grade. While some students with strong abilities and orthographic skills may overcome this initial difficulty, others who do not possess an ideal level of aptitude in this area may become overwhelmed. An earlier introduction of reading and writing skills may also help bridge the gap between elementary and junior high school curriculums. Lastly, there are great potential benefits of the FLES program on student attitudes towards language learning. While this study was not able to specifically pinpoint the attitudes towards language learning to the introduction of the FLES program itself, further research needs to look at the introduction of the FLES program and more clearly define the effect on these programs can have on learner perspectives and attitudes. Thank you for watching my presentation.